Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
So without further ado, I invite a PhD candidate, Michelle Harrington, to come and introduce our panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's my privilege to introduce to you our three speakers for this first panel entitled Gender and War. First off, chairing and responding, we have Deborah Erickson. Deborah received her PhD here at the Divinity School in 2010 and is now teaching as visiting professor of religious studies at Siena College in Albany, New York. She has also taught at the Catholic Theological Union and DePaul University. This year, she was selected for a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute in Ethics and Development, which supported her research in global ethics, and she's currently adapting her dissertation on casuistry and environmental ethics into a book for which she is drawing upon the just war tradition. Speaking after Deborah, or our first speaker, I guess, will be John Carlson, who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University. His research explores how religious and moral inquiry informs and invigorates our understanding of political life. Professor Carlson has co-edited and contributed to 3 books, including From Jeremiah to Jihad, Religion, Violence, and America, that was published in 2012, and The Sacred and the Sovereign, Religion and International Politics, which was published in 2003. He's the author of 20 book chapters and journal articles, and is currently working on a monograph entitled Justice This Side of Heaven, Human Nature, Religion, and the Moral Order of Politics, which is a political theological examination of how ideas about human nature and humanity's relation to the divine shape and limit our political pursuits of justice. John Carlson's talk today is entitled Jean Bethke Elshtain's Lost Beautiful Soul, or the Education of a Just War Thinker. Our second speaker today will be Christine Sylvester, and she's professor of political science and women's studies at the University of Connecticut, where she works in the field of international relations. There, she is affiliated with the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Her areas of research include feminist international relations, European approaches to IR, and critical development theory and practice with a focus on Africa. Professor Sylvester has worked extensively outside of the U.S., is regularly invited to lecture abroad at the United Nations University in Tokyo, among other universities, and has been recognized as one of 50 key thinkers in international relations. Her most recent research publications are on war as experience and on art and museums as sites of international relations. She's the editor of a Routledge book series, War, Politics, Experience. Today, Professor Sylvester will present her talk entitled Essential Elshtain, Women and War. Thanks.
So we've actually decided to switch the order of the speakers so that Christine Sylvester will be going first.
Okay. I was settling in here. All right, thank you. It's a real distinct privilege to be here today, to be invited to speak here. And for me, perhaps one of the biggest privileges and pleasures of this is the chance to meet Jean's family, about whom she'd spoken to me many, many times over the years that I knew her, but I never met anyone in the family, so it's delightful to have that opportunity here. I wasn't sure if they would be here, so this is terrific. My field is international relations and feminist IR, and so I am not really going to be speaking much on just war theory or religion at all. That's actually not where I come from. I do want to focus, though, perhaps a little unusually, on one of Jean's earliest books, Women and War, which I find it was the most inspiring book for my own development in thinking on war, and for the project I now run mainly in Europe and Australia, a research project called Experiencing War, which is about physical, emotional, ethical experiences of war, and war as experience on the ground, as opposed to a series of what my field would call causes, types, and strategies. that abstract above individuals. Now, you know from probably other speakers at the Engaged Mind conferences that Women in War was written in 1987, and it was a feminist theoretical and empirical work dedicated to revealing the experiences of women in and around wars. Experiences that had been for a long time overdubbed, would be a charitable way of putting it, by narratives of war recorded by men and men soldiers. And she brings out in her book a variety of historical and literary figures, women who actually deserve to be part of the narratives of war. It is a book that is now quite a number of years in the past, and it's one I still assign both to my undergraduate and my graduate students in Gender and War. And it is, I always tell them, you have to mentally update some of the arguments here and some of the examples. But it is a war that characteristically every single time we read it, the students like it. They always say they like it very much. And my best PhD student at the moment, when he first finally got to read Women in War, said to me, "Why have people been holding this back from me in my whole training?" And I said, "I don't think anyone's been holding it back," but he really thinks quite a great deal of it. Now, the way I want to proceed is I want to talk about certain tracings and then certain themes in Women in War. Two particular foreshadowings, I would say, that emerged there early on that help us to understand, or help me to understand Jean in her later years. The first tracing would be of Jean as what I call the difficult feminist that she would later become. A difficult feminist I define as someone who claims identity as a feminist, draws on feminist thinking and words, and interprets or applies feminist knowledge idiosyncratically, so much so that a feminist community will disavow her and say she is not a feminist, actually. And she, I would say Jean fits this category, as do a number of very controversial women, and I'm taking kind of an interest in this and writing on this with a former PhD student of mine who's in Monash University in Australia on the difficult global feminist. And we're including in that people like Hirsi Ali, who claims to this day to be a feminist and says all of these things that feminists get very upset about, and Azar Nafizi as well with respect to her views on reading the erotic novel of Lolita in Tehran in the middle of Islamic Revolution. So I would say that Jean is right in there, an exemplary difficult feminist who has been disavowed by feminists for the past 15 years, I would say, or more, and in the worst cases seen as an imperialist traitor to the correct feminist causes, narratives, and community-endorsed practices. In fact, I was telling a few people over lunch how I had one experience of actually losing a job that I interviewed for, and that I found rather perplexing throughout the job. It was for a job interview. It was for a women's studies position a number of years ago, that I was constantly being asked about Jean Elshtain, not about my own work, but about Jean Elshtain. And did I really know her, and what did I think of her? And I thought these were kind of out of order questions, and I answered as best I could. And then I found out I lost the position because Jean Elshtain had written a letter of reference for me. And they were so put out by that they assumed I must be just, I don't know, some disciple or something, in a sense. And I was pleased to lose that job for that reason, I should tell you. Now, it wasn't always the view of the feminist community, such as it is, and I don't know how entirely to define it, but it wasn't always the view that Jean was on the outside and was in exile from it. They initially embraced Women in War, in her early book as well, Public Man, Private Woman, and then ostracized her later for a whole variety of crimes, such as disapprovals of gay marriage, approval of a just war in Iraq. She also became anathema in many important sectors of my field of international relations, such as peace studies, as well as a variety of critical international relations traditions, where she would be, if she turned up at a conference, would be really yelled at tremendously, and she always kept up her end, I must say. And also feminists who liked her early writings, which were more in a secular vein, were very disappointed when she seemed to be arguing more from a base in religious philosophies more and more as she went on in her career. Now, I never disavowed Jean, although I haven't agreed with her on a lot of things. Particularly, I haven't agreed with her turn away from people's experiences of war into abstract principles. I find that unfortunate that she made that switch. But I did share her view, and I shared her view to this day, that feminists can be, and other groups, can be very silencing of controversy and extremely difficult actually to engage in any kind of discussion on positions internationally, positions at home, and are very, very quick to judgment, very, very fast to judgment, and you're either in or you're out. And that's a position I've always found very uncomfortable. It could be because I do have what Jean once referred to as postmodern avoidances, that I do have this tendency to not want to jump on either side of these dichotomies. It's also the case that Jean gave me some very sound and important advice as a younger new scholar coming along, and she provided also very companionable company at the early emergence of feminist international relations, where we met constantly. We were constantly being asked to speak, and we talked and we communicated right up until last year, actually. And I heard from her, as I was suggesting, more about her family in a sense than her public words and persona probably allowed others to learn, although I didn't learn obviously that much. I hadn't met them. So the first tracing that you can begin to make through Women in War is the difficult feminist. The second is a tracing of the unchastened patriot who seems to morph into a patriot that should be perhaps chastened a bit more after 9/11. In Women in War, Jean advocates a position of chastened patriotism towards the end of the book. And this is what she says. She says, in quoting, "It modulates the rhetoric of high patriotic purpose by keeping alive the distancing voice of ironic remembrance and recognition of the way patriotism can shade into the excesses of nationalism. A recognition of the fact that patriotism in the form of armed civic virtue is a dangerous chimera." And I would say by the time she was writing Just War Against Terror, let's just say she was minimizing that particular set of warnings, and that made her a difficult patriot as well. Now, along with these tracings that I think we can make through that particular book, leading into some of her more recent writings, there are several themes that I think are worth bringing up in Women in War and revisiting, and I always revisit them. And these have something to do with the difficult feminist, the difficult patriot. Three themes. First, I think we can talk about how unusual and interesting and important it was that Jean's first chapter of her book, after her introduction, was her positioning of herself within the research. And it's a long chapter. It's not just a couple of pages. That's number one. I'll elaborate on each of these. The second is her peopling of war with mothers and other exogenous categories of beings, ordinary people. And the third is her blurring of some lines between the only two genders she accepted as true, men and women, in her discussion of the good soldier and the good mother, which I always found interesting, certainly not going far enough as we would like today. So let me start then with her insertion of herself in Not a Soldier's Tale, chapter 1. I would see this as an early autoethnographic chapter. In the field of international relations, autoethnography is now becoming talked about. I wouldn't say it's a big deal. There hasn't been a huge rush in that direction. But I would say that Jean started this trend off, even though the people who write autoethnography do not cite her. This is kind of classic with feminists who write in international relations. They're often not quite given credit for being at the beginning of certain trends. Now, autoethnography melds autobiographical elements of a person's life with stories of that person's research. And that reveals intersections, say, of fact and imagination, or self and other, or identity and culture. And this Jean does in an extended way that was unheard of in the mid-1980s for anyone in the field of international relations to elaborate on the reasons why they really have an authoritative voice to add to a particular topic. For my colleagues in international relations, I don't know if they're here, Chris is here, they'll know perhaps that Kenneth Waltz, who's one of our important figures in theory and international relations, in his theory of international politics, he is so out of the picture, which is hard to imagine for somebody who was at the University of Berkeley during the student movements, but I don't guess maybe he wasn't looking out his window too much at the activity below, but he actually takes himself so far out of that particular book that he doesn't dedicate it to anyone. There's no dedication to family, dog, friends, you know, anything. It's just there's no human contact of a sort in that book at all. And Jean is so much the opposite, writing at exactly the same time, by the way, that Kenneth Waltz was preparing Theory of International Politics. Here she tells her life story, her childhood, her interests, her talents, her dreams, her heroes, her early marriage, her kids, her study, and her thinking about international relations. She has this marvelous, pithy characterization of a field that many people who came along in the more critical veins later in the field in the post-Cold War period would actually recognize. This is what she says: encumbered with lifeless jargon, systems and subsystem dominance, spirals of misperception, decision-making analysis, bipolar, multipolar, intervening variables, dependence, interdependence, cost-effectiveness, IR specialists in the post-Second World War era began to speak exclusively to or at one another or their counterparts in government service. And clearly, she was not enamored with that particular approach, as many followers of her afterwards would not be either. She does something, I think, somewhat in response to her characterization of IR as rather lifeless. She does something outrageous again in Women in War. She decides she's not going to choose between her understanding of reality that comes from being in the private sphere, being a mother, among other things, in a private sphere, in order to be a scholar out in the public sphere. She's not going to bury herself in words, and she's not going to address only the public sphere. And again, I can't begin to characterize for you how remarkable and unusual in a field of guns and bombs, international relations, it would be for someone to be bringing in a maternal voice. Feminists did this a bit with people like Sarah Ruddock, who talked about lessons from the mother's home, and the women were always peaceful as a result of lessons they'd learned being mothers. And Jean Elshtain went really in a very different direction, and she survived. I mean, one of the things is the sub-themes of what I'm saying is Jean Elshtain survived in international relations while absolutely blowing the field apart at an early stage, and I'm always amazed that was absolutely possible. So in Women in War, she develops the argument that the public sphere actually needs the wisdom that develops in the private sphere, a sphere that's invisible to it. And this is where the chastened patriotism incubates, in a sense. It incubates in the private sphere and moves over into the public sphere. Now, her views, which are interesting at the time, also put her into the difficult feminist track pretty early on, in that much of the feminist thinking of the 60s and the 70s leading into the 80s was that the private sphere was a sphere of tyranny, it was the sphere of patriarchy. It was, if you don't mind me saying, right up there with organized religion as men's studies, in a sense, the center of men's studies. That's why they came up with the credo that the personal is political, in a sense, because there was no separation between the politics in the private and the politics in the public. But Jean argued that conflating these two spheres of power and knowledge, and she does quote Foucault, which she never probably quotes again, results in a collapse of the private where the mothers and women dwell instead of leaving room for the private sphere to develop the knowledge that can inform the public. And she was denounced roundly by an awful lot of feminists for actually arguing this. And she was so angered and hurt, I would actually say, by the denunciations that for years and years, even 20 years later, she would still be angry and taking pot shots at radical feminists who were everybody in feminism, actually. Even pro-choice feminists were called radical in her book, Sovereignty, God, State, and Self. She is against their controlling and their silencing. All right, so that is actually one of the first themes to develop, is bringing herself and her situation in. The second is her remarkable ability to see ordinary people in war as an international relations scholar, not as a historian or social historian, but as international relations. Because international relations up to that point had been peopleless. Oh yes, there was the odd leader, there was the odd general, Patton or what have you, but there was no everydayness, no ordinariness in a sense, no dailiness and prosaic quality in a sense to international relations. And she writes, the man and the woman in the street often knows how fragile it all is, how vulnerable we all are, also how powerful. And of course we can see this today. When you look at the Arab Spring, there's more emphasis in IR still today on the Arab Spring than on the Arab Springers. You know, there's very little coming from their voice. We just talk about this phenomenon in a sense, and IR is still not looking at the man and the woman in the street who are extremely powerful and actually moving international relations today. And so she foregrounded ordinary women in war, and she also made this wonderful observation that she thought that one of the reasons women were invisible in war, and she has lots of examples where they were there, is because there's no social institution to channel women in violence the way war channels men in violence. So that when women become violent, they're mad. You know, they must be out of control emotionally and completely mad. And so you always see the adjective woman suicide bomber or woman gun something. Because obviously you have to add that for people to recognize the madness of what they're about to read about, in a sense. Now, where she became a bit difficult here again was then in her later book, she started talking about women over there in other contexts of war or religious community, like in Taliban Afghanistan. And a lot of thinking in feminism had shifted from the universal woman to difference, right? And how it's important to hear the voices of different kinds of people and let them speak themselves. And she has been more recently accused by feminists of speaking or representing women abroad without having the credentials to do that, without actually having studied Afghanistan closely. So when you enter the culture cum war debate without credentials, it's a grave sin, in a sense, and that was another criticism leveled at her. The third theme I want to touch on briefly, because I'm getting notes that I have to finish quickly, is very controversial and very interesting in a sense. Her tendency in Women of War to ignore multiple genders while simultaneously recognizing that man and women is not an absolute dichotomy. This comes out in the Good Soldier, Good Mother set of analogies. She says the soldier's expected to sacrifice for his country as mothers are expected to sacrifice for their children. Soldiers like mothers are involved with food and shit and dirt, direct quote, and become preoccupied with stomachs and bodily fluids, and on and on. She goes on like this for about 4 pages, ending by saying women are excluded from war talk and men from baby talk. Now, much has happened to war and parenting since she wrote that. I mean, the combat exclusion clause of the military is gone, for example. Nonetheless, I would like to argue, and of course, the proliferation of genders, in a sense, from the two to a whole wonderful variety, that in a preliminary and very primitive way, Jean refused a lingering narrative on who owns war and who is out of war by making that analogy between the good soldier and the good mother. I would have hoped she'd push that further. It's a pity she had difficulty later crossing from the heterosexual model of women in war that's so informed her analysis to a more encompassing sense of mothers as men and soldiers as women, of lesbian dads and 2 gay moms, and of transgender and bisexual statuses having to do with the gender mix in war. Because, you know, don't ask, don't tell is also no longer on the books. I wonder if she would have done that, and I kind of suggest think that she wouldn't have, which makes her a continuing difficult feminist. So what to say at the end? I think Jean's wonderful, inspiring, and classic book is really something that we all should still be reading. Yet I would argue that her understanding of gender war in the larger world was perhaps too informed by her own particular autobiography, which is to say, Jean places herself, exasperatingly so for someone like me who is out traveling a lot and teaching and has been out of the United States for 18 years. I just came back last year to this position at the University of Connecticut. She's an American, and she talks about everything she speaks of comes from her American experiences and her sense of American exceptionalism, as well as her deepening religious convictions. And rarely in Elshtain will you see her war thinking informed by a different set of cultural experiences, which she would understand closely, a close textual reading of those experiences, not a sort of general journalistic understanding. She doesn't really seem to bring in the sense of the unfolding of their private spheres into their public spheres. And in a sense, she can't fully appreciate the fact that some see America as exceptionally interventionist and not as exceptionally just in what it does. And she's had limited experiences brought for a whole variety of reasons, I'm aware, that would help her to have moved beyond that autobiographically insertion of herself out into the world in a way that I think would be more persuasive. So let me just close, thank you, by saying that I think difficult feminists really exasperate their colleagues, but one thing that is sort of interesting about them, they never take their eye off women entirely in terms of being pro-women in a variety of ways, and so that also leads to us sort of smiling when we talk about Jean Elshtain. Thanks a lot.
Deborah assures me that she's not leaving because my talk is coming up, but just to get her jacket thing. Don't give me the 10 minutes remaining sign right now. Goodness gracious, I haven't even started. Here, get some light up here. Okay. So I was asked to discuss Jean Elshtain's Women in War book, and I had already been pondering her work and legacy for many months when she died. When this happened, my reading of the book, though, took a striking turn, for I discovered dramatically and very personally new meaning in the loss of her beautiful soul. The beautiful soul was one of two central tropes that served as lenses through which Jean examined the gendered history, politics, and experiences of war. My argument here is straightforward. Jean's efforts to lose or shake off the trappings of the beautiful soul mark the beginning of her emergence as one of the leading just war thinkers of our time. And two other thinkers I have in mind are sitting here in the audience. We've heard from Professor Walzer already, and James Derner Johnson will speak tomorrow, which, being sandwiched between them, leaves me feeling a little bit like watercress and a not very nourishing meal, some lettuce or something. So I'm thankful for the intellectual protein here that my fellow panelists are providing, especially Christine's lovely talk. So, borrowed from Hegel, Jean put the beautiful soul to her own use to criticize the representations of female identity that war purveys. The beautiful soul is, in her words, a collective being embodying values and virtues at odds with war's destructiveness, representing home and hearth and the humble verities of everyday life. This beautifully ensouled self inhabits private domains, reinforcing, in Hegel's words, the appearance of purity, but cultivating innocence about the historical course of the world. And much of Women in War is devoted to historical, literary, political, and even autobiographical recoveries of individuals who in some way embody this highly moralized form of beauty. Certainly the Madonna is the archetype. But pioneering feminists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton could also play the part, as could even Jean's favorite, Jane Addams, who spoke forcefully of women's maternal affection, the remembering heart, the imperative to preserve human life as a way of transforming men's militaristic pursuits. Her beautiful soul trope builds on the feminist discourse of the 70s and 80s, even as in some ways crashes down upon it. She considers from whence assumptions about men's violence and women's pacifism originate and how much work they continue to do in culture and in scholarship. Elshtain does not cobble together the stuffing of a straw man, or in this case, a straw woman, only that she might set it alight, though she has her matches at the ready quite often. Rather, she insists upon understanding the hopes and aspirations of the peace-seeking women she examines, for there may yet be something to be retained, even redeemed therein. Such a project, though, begins with critique and the respect that critique commands. Elshtain worries that Jane Addams' idealizations weakened the cogency of her case by assuming that women's suffrage would automatically humanize governments. This gives Addams license to evade many tough questions about power and responses to the use of force, urgent problems to which Elshtain later returned. So the loss of the beautiful soul, or at least its qualification, was inevitable, intended, and apt. And Women in War helped facilitate this loss through its empirical and normative undertakings, as I'll discuss. But it does so without closing the door entirely on the beautiful soul's civic-minded and civic-hearted features. Civic virtue, its meanings and longings, and its related concepts and obligations of citizenship became overarching concerns running throughout Elshtain's war corpus, and the tool with which she first pries open this abundant storehouse of fascinating ideas is the study of gender. Now, the other trope, the male just warrior, was something of a misnomer, I would suggest, a too hazy moniker for all that she wanted it to encompass. At the very least, we must distinguish Jean's just warrior trope from just war thought as she and most of us understand it. Her just warrior is concerned with the ethics of war primarily as it raises questions about civic duty, allegiance, sacrifice. Morality or virtue is sifted quite finely through the screen of politics and patriotism, or to the refrain of "we few, we happy few," to recall Henry V. Even crusading or holy warriors can take shelter under this category at times, Jean notes. So most crucial to Elshtain's just warrior, or what I would rechristen as the virtuous warrior, is the ability to tap into the oldest conception of what it means to be a citizen, the willingness to kill and to die on behalf of one's political community. To be a citizen was to be a warrior, was to be a man. Yet this view of the warrior, or the virtuous warrior, cannot be severed neatly from other accounts that Jean eschews. For example, as she knows well because she taught me, Machiavelli intrinsically links virtu to masculinity and virility, which must seize and overpower the feminine fortuna, whose violent and ungovernable rivers Christine alluded to. Whether writing of Renaissance princes or Christian knights, neither of whom, in Jean's words, seem to have tormented themselves overmuch concerning the justice of their cause, or writing of Tommies and doughboys in the Great War whose nations sanctified their war effort, turning it toward the crusading extreme, many who claimed the mantle of the just warrior become foils in Jean's later just war project. So this brings us to the importance or the purposes of these two tropes in her work. They needed to be scrambled because there have always been counter-types and counter-narratives that defy the stereotypes. War-hating men and war-loving women, mama's boys and male conscientious objectors, unwilling to fight or die, as well as Spartan mothers eager or willing to send their boys to die. The payoff of this empirical objective is evident in the epilogue of the book's second edition, which attests to the social transformations in the United States as 32,000 women were serving in the Persian Gulf War, many challenging their non-combatant status. Jean welcomed, quote, the final defeat of various myths that women are weaker and need protecting, that they're physically incapable of handling combat. But she also found herself clinging to certain beautiful soul vestiges that others were eager to jettison, as she reminded us of the cost to society and human relationships when conflicting claims of soldiering and motherhood are placed upon some service women. So the loss of the beautiful soul is not an either-or proposition, either the Madonna or the Spartan mother, either Jane Addams or Joan of Arc, either the mother suckling the newborn or the soldier forced to leave her children behind to fight. For every private Jessica Lynch who's injured in combat, taken POW, there's a Cindy Sheehan whose son was killed in action, comes the occasion for protesting the war. So the beautiful soul and just warrior were never intended to be preserved as they'd been handed down. They suggest a gender gulf that does not comport with reality. This evidence of this can be found in a poll of American support for the 2001 invasion in Afghanistan. There are more male hawks than female hawks, more female doves than male doves. But those are the extremes. More remarkable is the equal gendering of those in the middle, those who are reluctant warriors, willing supporters, some 65% of the population. So Jean's work anticipates and helps to explain these empirical trends. She helped us to understand society and the world around us. We recall that she began her academic career in history, and that the historian in Jean remained front and center, if occasionally hiding in plain sight. There's no substitute for the facts, she wrote. If we get our descriptions of events wrong, our analyses and our ethics will be wrong too. As we say around here sometimes in Swift Hall, the ethicist must always aggressively engage the question of what's going on. But history and context first, ethics after. Yet beyond this lie the normative questions. What shall we do now? Where do we go from here? This, then, the ethical burden of these tropes. She nuances and scrambles the categories, retaining from both tropes and for both sexes the mutual quest for civic virtue, particularly in the face of war. What is this via medio? She lobbied for innovative ways of disarming civic virtue, more ethically robust ways of thinking about war when it is necessary. In this way, it's not surprising that after beginning loosely with Hegel, she ends Women in War with a kind of Hegelian synthesis, what she calls the chastened patriot, laying the groundwork for her deep dive into just war thought. She invokes King, she invokes Lincoln, proposing how their patriotism taps love of country that yields civic concern for country, but which distinguishes itself from nationalistic variances, the excesses of Machiavellian virtue, holy war fervor. Now, at best, Jean only gestures to the norms that this chastened patriot trope entails, but with the clarity of hindsight, what a gesture this turns out to be. For what Elshtain presumes is that the chastened patriot will perceive how the binary framing of these tropes have served as reigning repositories for all manner of other pernicious, over-simple binaries that cramp our moral reflection. Overlaid onto man and woman are public and private, active and passive, civic paragon, second-class citizen, life-taker, life-giver, armed virtue, pacific love. War throws these binaries into relief. Moreover, if war is a way of understanding politics, as she contends, then these bothersome binaries are active within politics more broadly, including the resilient bifurcation of war and peace itself. So these various ideas, the embrace of a politics beyond war and peace, and a civic language appropriate to it, the obligations of chastened patriots to think critically and affirmatively about their countries, these seeds are planted in Women in War. They grow deeper in her theological writings, but most importantly, for at least most publicly visible, the blossoming of these ideas grow in her contribution to what we now know as just war politics. Now, interestingly, the just war tradition receives a relatively brief treatment in Women in War. The field was not then what it is today, largely shaped by Michael Walzer's landmark Just and Unjust Wars, or the U.S. Catholic Bishop's pastoral letter. I don't know that Jean had yet encountered Jim Johnson's work or knew of his or had read Paul Ramsey. I'm not sure. In short, this was a male-dominated field, as it remains today. But it should be no surprise in this sense that Jean's entree into the fray, initially dubbed just war as civic virtue, was shaped by the gender discussions of war. This refers to a mode involving, in her words, deep reflection by every man and every woman on what his or her government is up to. Bounded by a sense of responsibility, a morally formed civic character is the precondition of just war thinking. Several of these moral dispositions and civic orientations are also found within the Beautiful Souls reservoir. Now, to be sure, she follows certain leads, Walzer's Just War's political philosophy, but she initially seemed much more taken by the bishop's letter, addressed to many and all citizens, taking a hard line against all forms of total war. Yet even this form of civic engagement would eventually prove wanting for Jean. Her starting place for thinking about force was not the so-called presumption against war, as it was for the bishops. She was, like Augustine, too troubled by the ambivalence of peace and the evils that can traffic under an unjust peace. So what she found most compelling was not a view of just war thinking that simply sets limits and restraints on the use of force when war is in the offing. She knew all these traditional criteria. She just didn't view them as fixed fence posts that form a kind of cordon around our ethical thinking, as some just war thinkers use them. Indeed, quite the opposite. She found inspiration in the ways that just war reflection opened up a larger moral vista onto our horizon of politics. In words she uttered many times in many places, just war is not just about war. It's a way of thinking that refuses to separate politics from ethics. Nor was just war simply an ethic for statesmen or for soldiers. It was for chastened patriots, a moral vocabulary wanting in political discourse at the time that was overly dominated by realism and game theory. It was a religiously authentic and ethically rigorous alternative to pacifism and holy war, a civic framework for anchoring and extending moral debate, not for limiting it. So what this meant over time, though, is that Jean's evolving understanding of just war politics could actually evoke more permissive resorts to force. For in deflating absolute distinctions between war and peace, she located force along a continuum of coercion as an imperfect response measured along the relative scales of justice and injustice. Now, to give an illustration of the ways in which just war politics expanded this aperture of moral reflection, consider these lines. As of this writing, Iraqi citizens are suffering greatly under a continuing regime of sanctions that appear to have had little effect on Saddam Hussein's ability to hold on to power. Just war thinking would suggest that this form of apparent benign intervention, by contrast to actual war fighting, is not in fact ethically pristine, even apart from whether or not it's politically effective. The rush to use embargoes and sanctions that target whole populations, harming the least powerful first, requires more justification than it has received from past and current policymakers. Now, one might think that these lines were part of her controversial arguments for invading Iraq in 2003, but when she penned these lines in 1994, after the Persian Gulf War ended, indeed, she was already writing about issues that have not yet been fully tapped or only beginning to be discussed, ideas such as jus post bellum, to which Professor Walzer alluded. Such an account makes clear, or clearer at least, how Elshtain could challenge the idea of just war as some kind of State Department flowchart to legitimate war, or, from the other direction, a confining moral theory that's wrapped like some kind of iron corset around the state to limit its resort to force. For Jean, however, just war politics had been in play long before the Iraq invasion, just as coercion and force had been underway for a dozen years before Saddam Hussein was overthrown. Now, initially, the chastened patriot was the courier of these various values, norms, and claims that became just war politics. This included her recovery of Augustine's moral anthropology. Already in Women and War, she extolled how women figure centrally in Augustine's world, particularly his understanding of the peace of the home that contributes to the peace of the political sphere, a deep contrast to the Greek Republican theory separating oikos from polis. The just war chastened patriot is committed to the concrete social relations and political commitments that define her immediate contexts, yet she is also spurred to extend her moral field of concern to other moral claims and loyalties, including universalistic claims about human dignity. The precept by which this vision would be instituted was Jean's justice as equal regard, a position which extends just war from a restrictive account of morally justifiable self-defense to a staunchly interventionist account of international justice involving genocide or oppression. Here she distinguished international justice from the prevailing mode of humanitarian intervention that relied upon pity, sympathy, or compassion. In other words, she opts for the chastened patriot over the beautiful soul. And we also observe here Elshtain's abandonment of the bishop's presumption against war. She favors instead a presumptive case in favor of the use of armed force by a powerful state or alliance of states who have the means to intervene, to interdict, and to punish others. Ironically, the chastened patriot she initially promotes as a position that tames and disarms civic virtue ultimately gives way to a more controversial, even combative ethic on behalf of a now globalized vision of just war politics. But even this vision is something that she did all along in Women in War, a citizenship model, one now molded for the 21st century. To be sure, Jean's forceful, patriotic voice struck harsh chords with some critics who claimed that she, of all people, stood in need of chastening, especially for supporting George W. Bush's administration in its various foreign policies. Yet we ought not to forget her rebuke of George H.W. Bush's selective use of just war ideas in the Gulf War. As well, while she was castigated for her defense of coercive interrogation, this was something of an outlier position given all of her other jus in bello critiques of other U.S. wars. More on that in a moment. So Jean's just war politics presupposes then a certain universal vision of peace. Not just any peace, mind you, but a just peace. And in her effort to put critical pressure on all forms of nationalistic absolutism, her love for her country was never grounded in provincial exclusivism. Now, in the words of a famous interwar hymn song, a hymn that I was thinking about, she could believe that my country's skies may be bluer than the ocean, while also appreciating that other countries' skies are everywhere as blue as mine. These themes framed around women come out in her Just War book, including the epilogue devoted to 4 brave women from Algeria, Uzbekistan, Somalia, and Iran, all of whom shared aspirations for basic freedoms, rights, security, education, and the promise of citizenship that all women desire for their children and themselves. Such a vision of politics that combines universal aspirations with highly particularized civic loves and loyalties flows from Elshtain's novel Just War approach, which, owing to its roots in gender analysis, proposes a more expansive role for women in politics. Now, I want to allude briefly to a final dimension of her Just War politics position, first set out in the book, the importance of sacrifice. Confederate wife Mary Boykin Chestnut recalls, "Fasted yesterday all day, not one morsel I tasted all day. Men to war, women to suffer." Boykin's private war diary served clear public purposes. Elshtain says that they made her case and they plead her cause, and she, Elshtain, is clearly moved by this, even as she had been as a teenager when she learned of the death of young revolutionary Nathan Hale, whose words, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country," sent Jean, in her words, into a fever pitch for nearly a year. Chastening, huh? Yeah. Okay, we often hear, though, that so anyway, this is the question of sacrifice, and I'm going to kind of back into this a little from a little bit different angle. We often hear in these days that the essence of democracy is compromise. But I wonder if the essence of democracy isn't learning how to lose. After every presidential election, the losing candidate concedes the race, extolling the majesty of the democratic process. The losing candidates retreat and do some soul-searching, figure out how to win next time. But whether you look to the recent coup in Egypt or to the shutdown of our government in Washington, there are still many who have not yet learned this vital lesson of democracy. As I return to Women in War, I was struck by Jean's insistence that in war, too, a nation must learn how to endure defeats, or at least make difficult sacrifices. This recurring theme in her writings begins early. For example, in a 1972 diary entry reprinted in Women in War. Harry Truman's funeral just started. I'm not sure about Truman. He may have been directly responsible for more human deaths than any other American president. Truman proposed it is better to kill Asians in any number than to risk the deaths of Americans, our boys, in any number. This calculus is lodged not in respect for human life, in which case one wishes the deaths or injuries of as few people as possible, but in ethnocentrism, if not racism. Did he ever put himself in Hiroshima? I suppose not, and that's probably why they say the presidency never aged. Now, in moments such as this, and an entry from a private diary clearly intended for public purposes, Elshtain reminds democracies of their fundamental commitments to human dignity and equality. And we might be tempted to dismiss the atomic bombings of Japan as a one-off, the terror bombings of Germany as aberrations in the face of supreme emergencies, but Elshtain doesn't let us off the hook so easily. She also recalls the turkey shoot that American forces were engaged in against fleeing Iraqi soldiers on the highway of death. She denounces Clinton's strategy of combatant immunity in Kosovo. This no ground troops policy, I should add, has now become virtually a requirement for all future humanitarian interventions, as seen in Libya, perhaps calls for force in Syria. Her justice as equal regard position proposes greater willingness to sacrifice, she makes clear. Now, I'm a little more sanguine than Elshtain about the ethics of reluctance that she reviles, but she is surely right to remind us that at various historical moments, democratic nations are obliged to reconcile their tactics with their principles. And the willingness of citizens to make difficult sacrifices, even to lose a war, will determine whether they will stand out in history as a nation of civically virtuous but chastened patriots, or of reluctant warriors and self-seeking isolationists. So let me conclude. Through her self-education, beginning at a young age and colorfully portrayed in Women in War, Jean Bethke Elshtain became a leading just war thinker of her day. Her just war politics became the civic language of chastened patriotism, a language she spoke fluently, if not always consistently. This is why we stand in need of other chastened patriots to debate, refine, or even correct her positions, and she would surely agree with this. The chastened patriot, though, is not constructed ex nihilo, but rather is born of its maternal and paternal forebears. Beautiful souls and virtuous warriors, however much they have evolved in some ways or dissolved in others, are part of the chastened patriot's DNA. As Elshtain herself understands, wartime's beautiful soul is no ordinary wife or mother or secretary or nurse, or I would add professor. She becomes rather a civic being. She's needed by others. She can respond simultaneously to what Jane Addams called the family claim and the social claim. For she is told, without her unselfish devotion to country and family, each would be lost. Elshtain herself aspired to be among such women who yearn for public identities as civic beings, serving ends that take them beyond the borders of private lives. On this account, Jean Bethke Elshtain, the just war thinker, was a great civic being. Devoted to family and country, she was in turn deeply appreciated and needed by both. She was always a scholar and a patriot, at times chastened, at other times less so. But in her public and private roles, she was also incontrovertibly a beautiful soul. And in her passing, oh, what a beautiful soul we all have lost. Thank you.
Hopefully I won't need the time reminder. When Jean and I began planning this conference series nearly 5 years ago, before I left the Divinity School for my current position, I had no idea that I would end up on the program. But I also didn't think that we would be having this conference without her. So I'm grateful for the chance to engage her work publicly as part of this series, as well as to consider with my fellow panelists her enduring contribution. And here I want to mention the fact that they're from different disciplines is merely one indication of how far Jean's reach extended. And I should also say that their papers were a respondent's dream. Enough points of commonality that I had something to work with, but enough points of difference that I could hope to say something interesting.
Not very timely.
Oh, no, you were fine. I think we're all set. So I came to Elshtain's work later than either John or Christine. And what this meant is that I read Just War Against Terror several years before Women in War. And I struggled to connect the author of the earlier book, dedicated to the memory of John Lennon, and seemingly wary of both war and the American prosecution of it, with the Jean I knew who wrote the later book, Just War Against Terror. By the time I came to study with her, she was firmly considered right-wing by most of her peers in the academy. It hardly seemed possible that she was the same person who was against the Vietnam War, who answered Kennedy's call to public service, and who joined a feminist consciousness-raising group in Boston during her graduate school years. In fact, for me, this is the central mystery of Elshtain's work on war. But in tracing Elshtain's intellectual development, these two papers have done much to unravel the mystery, for me at least. And here I want to note I'm working from their full papers. I think I've managed to hit mostly notes you've talked about, but in case there's something that sounds like a mystery, that's why. Sylvester and Carlson's papers have some significant points of commonality. And these we might call the hallmarks of Elshtainian thought, some of which Michael Walzer has already listed for us so helpfully. The points where they differ, however, support the contention that Elshtain was not only a difficult feminist, but a difficult just war theorist as well. They note several key characteristics. Among them, an enduring occupation with ordinary life, a preference for experience and history over theory, and a deep commitment to America and to American values. But as Sylvester deftly illustrated, Elshtain also inserted herself into the structure of her arguments, making the personal political in a way that defied the typical meaning of that phrase. She could do this because of her understanding of human nature rooted in an Augustinian idea of shared humanity, that neither time nor distance separates us so much that we are unrecognizable to each other. For Elshtain, experience shapes but does not constrain. As Elshtain, the non-combatant, could consider herself to have experienced war, so political theorists can and should account for civilian experience in their reflections on war and peace. Elshtain suggests that the lofty aspirations of international relations risks leaving behind the people who constitute the political communities that matter to international relations, that is, the ordinary person living in a polity. The central place of mothering in Elshtain's life and work, unlike many contemporary professional women, there was no time in her adult life when she was not a mother, is a significant feature of her scholarship, and it shapes her view of gender, perhaps more than she acknowledged. Both papers noted that Elshtain's love for her home country, for its ideals and its way of life, is inescapable in her writing. Sylvester sees this as clouding her judgment, leading her to near jingoism in her later writings on war. Elshtain did not apologize for this. She was never uncritical, yet she appraised the threat to the American way of life differently than some, perhaps most, of her peers. For those suspicious of power in any form, the sole superpower is by definition morally deficient. For those, like Elshtain, who saw the world differently, in a more Augustinian vein, power could be neutral, peace could masquerade as war, and the lust for domination would always need to be contained. Both our speakers also noticed that Women in War represents a deconstructive or post-structuralist approach to scholarship that nearly disappears in her work. This rhetorical analysis of the tropes of the beautiful soul and the just warrior. She takes them apart in a way that she seems to sort of forgo later. They both also argue that this book is foundational in her later thought, although in different ways. Sylvester perhaps prefers the earlier feminist incarnation of Elshtain, expressing at least some discomfort for her turn to the religious, while Carlson shows an appreciation for the later Jean, seeing her departures from classic just war thought as part of her unique contribution, and a welcome alternative to the other religiously grounded approaches to war, pacifism, or holy war. Carlson called this approach just war as politics. Elshtain's reasons for supporting the war against terror are the same as she would give for any just war-making effort: to, in her words, intervene, interdict, and punish violence, because there are groups of people who will use force to eliminate others they judge, Elshtain's words again, not fit to share this beautiful earth. What I'm calling Elshtain's liberal internationalism held that anywhere there are people whose way of life is threatened with violent extinction, those who have the means to stop them must come to the defense of those who cannot defend themselves. This principle applied whether the people targeted for elimination were Americans or Algerians. Her principle was neither rights-based nor state-based. Rather, it arose out of our common humanity, out of a familial identity rather than a political one. That's why it's troubling to international relations scholars and gender theorists alike. So why does this point of view matter? I return here to two themes Carlson's paper highlighted: Augustine and the chastened patriot. I want to emphasize for a moment the theological elements of Elshtain's reasoning. She was not, as she herself noted, a theologian, although she conversed with many. She illustrated a way to bring theological categories, and not just any theology, but distinctively Christian theological categories, into public discourse without stripping them of their distinctive qualities. In a time when Rawls's public reason often defines the boundaries of legitimate public speech, Elshtain asks, in Just War Against Terror, where is the legacy of Niebuhr and Tillich? For if we cannot separate ethics from politics, neither can we separate theology from politics, or at least from views about the means and ends of politics. Elshtain's Augustinian anthropology is set within an Augustinian view of the present as an in-between time. The city of God and the city of man journey together, intermixed in the secular realm until such time as God brings about the end of history and separates the two, sending them each to their ultimate destiny. This idea of an in-between time is a theological category, and I don't think there's any other way to interpret it. And I also do not know that we can properly understand her work without acknowledging this. It was this idea that propelled her to argue against all pretensions of politics as ultimate, against utopias, feminist or otherwise, and against any kind of Kantian perpetual peace. Elshtain saw that the desires for good outcomes could have disastrous consequences if they were premised on one of two mistaken ideas: a misapprehension of human propensities or an overestimation of what was possible in this world. Part of her Augustinian anthropology was the assumption that there will always be human beings who will give in to the lust for domination. in violent ways. These violent tendencies cannot be explained away as, variously, rooted in economic deprivation, products of a patriarchal social order, or response to past political wounds. As we have heard, part of the job of politics is to restrain the lust for domination, to protect those who would fall prey to its rapacity. For this reason, Elshtain viewed politics, and therefore just war as politics, positively, as a form of other regard, sharing features of both love and justice. Reinhold Niebuhr argued that these two were paradoxically related, and Elshtain would probably agree. She consistently claimed that the public and private, while distinct, could never be entirely separated from each other. Love is the virtue most associated with the family, although as caritas, it has an impartial face, while justice most properly characterizes the public realm. Christianity, Elshtain emphasized, is both and, not either or. And this model that Carlson has presented to us, the model of just war as politics, of war as a form of other regard, relies not only on an Augustinian anthropology, but also, perhaps, on the Christian belief that death is not the worst thing that can happen to someone, that there are things worth dying for, not just fellow citizens or family under attack, but vulnerable others as well, as there are things worth killing for. As Walzer alluded to earlier, if faced with the threat of violence, one may choose to die rather than to kill. But one may not choose to stand by while others are slaughtered, if one has the means to stop it, and even perhaps if one cannot stop it entirely. Along with the binaries of war and peace, male and female, beautiful soul and just warrior, public and private, Elshtain challenges the binary between killing and dying. Or as Carlson put it, sacrifice is somewhere in between winning and losing. This conviction that there are things worth dying for, that is, worth giving up one's life, the epitome of caritas in the Christian tradition, may also be behind Elshtain's hesitancy, which Carlson noted, to approve riskless warfare. Those who would declare a no-casualty war may therefore not be fully convinced of the justness of the cause. Perhaps. Carlson notes that no-risk warfare violates justice's equal regard. It implies or outright holds that American lives are worth more than other lives. This is a difficult view for traditional just war theory, focused as it is on minimizing casualties. Religious overtones aside, Sylvester's paper raises other charges against Elshtain's work on both war and gender. They're not necessarily views that she completely shares, but they are ones that deserve attention precisely because they contend that despite Elshtain's view of a certain set of universal values, she herself may have been wedded to only one way of life, a Christian, American, heterosexual account of human life that risked squeezing out other ways of being, particularly Islamic or non-Western, multiply gendered or non-heterosexual. Elshtain, the feminist trailblazer on this account, becomes Elshtain, the right-wing reactionary. It raises the question of the locus of the change. Did the field change while Elshtain did not? Did Elshtain depart from the field? Or did the world change and Elshtain changed with it while the field followed its prior trajectory? Or we might say vice versa. So I'd like to pick up on the theme of gender, putting Sylvester and Carlson's papers in dialogue. What might Elshtain's Augustinian chastened patriot have to do with heterosexuality and gender dualism? Carlson brought up the matter of women in the military, which Elshtain raised in Women in War and returned to in its epilogue. She seems to be leaning towards a kind of gender neutrality in the armed forces, as in the civic realm, but not going so far as gender interchangeability. She realizes that mothers of infants may not belong on the front. This position is difficult for some feminist theorists who posit an unbridgeable gulf between the ideas of male and female, even as they argue that the categories are socially constructed and therefore subject to alteration or elimination at will. But in matters of life and death, women and men are not equal. Without, to use an Elshtain phrase, reducing women to uteruses, people with uteruses are the ones who can gestate and bear a child. It stands to reason, then, that should a country ever need to call up everyone to defend itself, women of childbearing years should not be sent in equal numbers with men to the front, lest a generation's worth of children be lost. Surely, women should not be barred from any kind of public service, including military service, if they so choose to take up those positions. But even Elshtain's civic feminism cannot negate these biological necessities. And I'm not sure she would argue that it should. An enduring problem for feminism is that women can do it all, in the sense that they are full human beings, and yet they can't. Feminism has not yet been able to untie the Gordian knot of the family claim and the civic claim. And I, from my perspective, am not sanguine that anything really can. Here again, Elshtain's biography comes into view. She had said, or I have heard her say, that she always just assumed she would have a family and a job, and that characterized her entire adult life. She never really agonized over it, as far as I can tell, although I did know her best when her children were mostly raised. I know few women like that now. Few women aiming at a public life are married at 18. Fewer still have children before 30. Even one of Elshtain's heroes, Jane Addams, could not negotiate the family claim. To the best of my recollection, Jane Addams was childless and unmarried, as were most of her Hull House compatriots. In opening up opportunities for women by weakening the strong divide between public and private, second-wave feminism also weakened the inherited givens of male and female. And, as Elshtain argued in her more combative moments, radical feminism tried to eliminate biological as well as social and political givens. Now, today, not just gender, but even sex is no longer a given, a point to which Sylvester alluded in her paper. For Elshtain, however, talk of men and women cannot be separated from talk about children. This may be one reason that she sees, and I'm quoting here from Sylvester's paper, only two genders and a bedrock of heterosexuality linking them. She offers us a civic being whose gender, while present, is muted. Rather than multiplying and complexifying gender, Elshtain seemed to take a kind of Rawlsian approach, with some aspects of gender, like some aspects of religion, relegated to the private realm. And here I'm thinking particularly of John Carlson's idea of the virtuous warrior. I wonder, however, whether there was beneath all of her writing, both on gender and on war, an idea of natural law that is present but not fully developed, part of her religious sensibility along with her Augustinian anthropology. And so I found it interesting that Professor Walzer also brought this up in his talk. For Elshtain, the original sin was not patriarchy, and the cause of war was not male aggressiveness. Rather, the cause was the desire for self above others, which could equally be felt by women as well as men. This is part of the reason she was a troublesome feminist, and perhaps it also makes her a troublesome just war theorist. In response to this, she offers us the chastened patriot, one whose desire for self, manifest as the desire for country above all, is chastened. The chastened patriot is willing to sacrifice not just for country, but to defend the defenseless. In this sense, the epitome of the soldier mother or mother soldier. In her work and in her life, Jean was a fighter. Instead of arms, she took up the pen, and she was not afraid to defend her life, to spend her life defending the things and the people that mattered most. Thanks. So I guess we'll take questions now. We have, it looks like 18 minutes or so. We have to 4 o'clock, right? So if you'll just give your name and indicate to whom you're directing your question. We've stunned you into silence. Yes, Professor Johnson.
I'm James Johnson. I wonder if any of the three of you have reflected on whether these categories that Jean uses for women in women war are really do they really cover the ground? And I'm thinking about other ways of characterizing differences. For example, the medieval definition of women as non-combatants that you find in the West, and a similar definition you find in the Islamic tradition, where the focus is really on, as much as anything, on functionality, on whether women can function as soldiers or not. In both these cultures, they entirely did not, but they largely did not, because the weapons of war were such that you needed to have the strength of a man to wield them. But then there was also a social aspect that is within society as it was structured in these two cultures. The role of women was such that they did not, in normal circumstances, take part in it. That was something that men took. And I guess my question is whether one doesn't also need to talk about ways that male-female differences vis-a-vis warfare are handled in other social and destructive contexts, and what that would mean for the way that Jean handled the war.
Deborah, can you repeat the question? Just because it's all not clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Try.
Or professional.
So Professor Johnson asked whether or not we need to consider other ways, other cultures, and how women they approached women and men in warfare, and why they may not have sent women into war, why women didn't go into war, in evaluating these categories. Other times, yeah.
I can't talk about the historical as much. I'm going to pass that on to John, who will speak of it maybe. But I can talk about what I see as a complete shift with respect to what Mary Calder would write about as new wars of our time, the post-Cold War period, the wars that have child soldiers, not just women, carrying weapons, the wars where there is brutality is quite extraordinary, and hand-to-hand combat and chopping off the noses and arms and what have you. And not even going back, not even staying that close to the present, going back to the so-called national liberation wars, say in the frontline states of southern Africa that I'm quite familiar with. In these contexts outside the United States, and we can name many other contexts, there was not such a discussion about the functionality of women with respect to war. They were there. They've been there. 30%, for example, of the guerrilla forces in Zimbabwe were women, and that's not an unusual characterization. Today, 30% of a lot of the wars that go on currently are children under the age of 15. So I do think, that there's a certain Western understanding of women and strength and what have you that is just defied elsewhere in a variety of places. And because I think Jean was so focused really in on, well, I have to say, I think she was very focused in on raison d'etat, the state, and when should the state go to war. She's missing these other kinds of situations where the state is either the target of the war or the state is irrelevant. The state's gone away. The state in Somalia doesn't exist. The state on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's just, that's the rape capital of the world, in a sense. So, the state is not regulating it. It's not sitting down in many wars of our time and contemplating what should we do next, what's the just thing to do. It's quite moved so far away from that it's actually horrifying as well as intriguing, the degree to which women also will mutilate other people. And I have, as part of my Experiencing War project, a number of young colleagues who've gone out to do field work, which is sort of anathema in international relations historically. You sort of stay up above people and you theorize them, where they actually talk to women ex-combatants or women combatants and say, what did you do in this war? And they just, you really would, shudder at what they're describing they've done. And it's not because they were forced to necessarily, although there is that going on. It's because they had a particular politics. It isn't because they lost their husband or they lost their brother or what have you. They had a politics they were pursuing through violence, which is something that I think in the West in particular we still have, we struggle with more, I think, than in other places.
Thanks, Jim, for your question and for saving us from the silence. I guess I would add to this that in some ways this is a spin on a perennial kind of question, at least within women's studies, about nature and nurture. I mean, if you're thinking about, well, functionality is a functionality based on certain physical attributes, is it based upon social attributes, cultural things like that. This was a debate that Jean was in the midst of, and I don't think that she came down necessarily on one side or the other. At least I wouldn't judge that so much based upon my reading of her Women in War book. But I do recall an essay that she wrote called Against Androgyny. And she was certainly in that case taking to task those who thought that there were no differences, no significant differences between men and women based on biology and formation. So, this goes back to, I guess, to the question of, well, is the beautiful soul a kind of straw woman, and is and I don't think it entirely is. On the one hand, it's a category or trope she uses in part to help clarify a set of assumptions that many people hold, some of which she wants to affirm, but some of which she wants to challenge. And if you're saying, are these adequate tropes? No, in a way, because, I mean, as I said in the discussion of what she calls the just warrior, I think you have to call the virtuous warrior. There's plenty of those who she doesn't want to lift up as, at least later, as just warriors that she discusses under that frame. So I would agree, generally speaking, that to some extent this is she's doing a selective history, what she finds relevant. She finds to be the most relevant features of different stories, anecdotes, and many that are in some cases just being brought to people's attention in a way that nobody else had really brought to attention. So I don't know if that answers your question or addresses the concerns that you're raising.
Well, yes, I think both answers do. And I'm glad Christine brought in the subject of child soldiers, because that was certainly a related issue in both the cultures I was talking about. The first two categories that we find, other than clergy, are women and children, as people that are not to be directly intentionally attacked. And it's largely historically functional and social, in both cases, why you don't do that. But it seems to me that one of the really interesting things that's happening, and really tragic things that's happening in contemporary warfare, is that as these distinctions have broken down, the efforts to maintain non-combatant immunity have also eroded, precisely because they have depended so much on those. And so maybe another question is just to think about how much is at stake here in maintaining these distinctions for humanity and warfare.
I want to interject that in at least the written version of John's paper, he did mention the breakdown of the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, so I would love to hear your thoughts in answer to this question.
Sorry, I missed the question there. It's like the coffee shop downstairs must be closed, right? We're not just right on.
10 minutes.
So why don't you?
Yeah, Mr. McDonald.
I would like to hear from both Professor Sylvester and you, Deborah, about the recent discussions we've had in which our political leaders have agreed that women may assume any position in combat forces that to which they may be called or may decide to enlist. I'd be interested in both of your point of views. As I recall, the main objection to that came from the Marine Corps Commandant. As an ex-Marine during the Korean War, I have a certain point of view on that, but I'd be much interested in what's happening, because during World War II, the Korean War, we did not draft women into the military. Now, it appears we will be drafting women also into the infantry, into the artillery, just as we do men. What is your view of this present, if you would, political stance or reality of the situation today?
I think that I don't want to speak for Professor Elshtain on this, but in light of the things that she has written, she would probably lead some of us at least to consider what concerns there might be if there was going to be a strict egalitarian kind of draft. And this does go back to Jim's question about the role of nature in all of this. I mean, she did think, it wrote at different places, that women are different, that they have, by virtue of being child-bearing creatures, different longings, yearnings, orientations, and desires. And that shouldn't be a limit upon those who don't want to conform to that. But if you're establishing a large-scale social policy of the kind you're describing, that might be reason for concern. Now, I would offer just a brief anecdote from my own experience. I joined the Navy when all combatant ships were men. Combatant ships only had male sailors serving on, and non-combatant ships had females, or an oiler, for example, or an ammunition supply ship. Well, these may be non-combatant ships, but I mean, there's no question about what an oiler is doing out in the middle of the ocean in the middle of wartime, or an ammunition ship, right? It's resupplying, and it's going to be targeted. So one does have to make certain kinds of distinctions about, well, why is this a really relevant one that women might be able to serve here and not there? Gets a little trickier when you're talking about combatant aircraft, women being taken POW. Obviously, women face certain risks that men don't face as POWs. So these things sort of, as I understand it now, are being taken sort of one by one. I don't think that there are women being integrated into the SEALs. Women are not part of the SEAL teams, right, yet.
Yeah. Well, there's an application there, but I'm actually the regular combat troops on the ground. I can understand the Navy has a little bit of cleaner quarters than the one that we enjoy the most. I still have fungus in the ears of that. It's not uncommon to be away from any kind of cleansing, if you would, for a week or 10 days. And if you're in combat, it's assumed in the Marine Corps anyway, and when I was there, that you had to be able to carry out one of your wounded warriors adjacent to you. Now, those are real factors, which is why the Marine Corps combat, that I really question whether this is a wise policy, but he was overridden by the Defense Department, et cetera, by our political leaders. But I'm curious about, not your view, Professor Carlson.
It's okay, you can join a whole bunch of my students in the class.
I'm interested in Professor Sylvester's view and Deborah's view of this situation, because you might be, or your daughters might be, the ones that have to carry out guys like me, who were 6'3.5" and 210 pounds, etc.
Well, there's a lot of ways into this issue, and it's a very controversial issue. I mean, one way in is to think, to ask yourself how a lot of feminists are viewing this. And of course, there's no monolithic feminism, despite Jean's efforts to sort of paint feminism as radical. I mean, the liberal feminists would basically say that this is a matter of equal rights. This is just a matter of having women attain the same standard as men. And one of the problems with liberal feminism is you don't really question that standard. You just want women to share in what they've got, all right? And that's a career path today, that we don't have a draft. It's a career path for a lot of poor people, and a lot of poor women as well as poor men. And so this is sort of an opportunity to learn rather high technological skills. You can also look at it from Jean Elshtain's earlier perspective on who is the citizen and what you have to do to gain citizenship, the citoyen. I mean, she talked about, citizenship as being something you fight for, that nation emerges through war. And if you're excluded, in a sense, from any aspect of war, then you have a partial citizenship in some regard. And then it becomes more difficult for you actually to claim other kinds of citizen rights, because you actually haven't been part of the group that is fighting for the survival of that state. And that was very much Jean's view, that I've written about and responded to in many ways. Now, the radical feminists, such as they are, I don't know who they are these days, but there could be a view that basically would say that's just buying into the patriarchy. But that's such an old argument that it's really sort of passé. People don't tend to talk that way anymore in real life. They talk about the complexities of actually discrimination and issues against women. Now, the other thing that I think, of course, is sort of like the elephant in the room that's so big we stub our toe on it, is the fact that the changing nature of war. And if you're talking about Western war, you're talking about a highly technological war these days. You don't have to drag somebody out. The infantry is going down as the technology is going up in terms of dominance. And it strikes me that if you're sitting in Arizona or if you're sitting in Florida and you're guiding drones behind a computer, what difference does it make, what your strength is? And this goes also for naval operations and navigation, and also in terms of piloting and having combat forces planes. So I find that argument is really sort of based in a kind of a passing. It's still important, boots on the ground. That's what we see. That's what we see when we look in the media. But actually, you can't see the invisible warriors because you can't go into these rooms and watch them. It's just like you can't go into air traffic control towers and watch how actually planes are getting landed. It's the same kind of operation, but there's more and more that is going on that is different than the usual armored divisions, the infantry divisions, the artillery divisions of wars of the past.
I recognize that, but I also recognize that most of the casualties in Afghanistan are patrols that are out, if you would, physically moving through the area, sometimes in vehicles of one kind or another that are blown up, but others on foot, if we are looking at individual situations. And the same thing in Iraq. So although proportionately, I think your point is a good one, maybe 80% of our warriors may not be there, we can still have grunts, in my view, who are really out on the ground, sometimes going from house to house. And I think that right now, supposedly, the argument has been, no, women eligible to do that too. But they can't be held back just because they happen to be physically perhaps less well equipped to do that work than men. And what is your personal view? I did not get your personal view out of the comment.
Well, I think a lot of contemporary feminism is about expanding people's choices as opposed to prescribing outcomes and policy directions. And I think that this does expand a variety of people's choices, women's choices. There are tricky issues. I would say the trickier issues are, what happens when two partners are both involved in the military, because that's often how you meet partners, in the work that you're doing, and both are deployed at the same time to a combat zone, which is happening. It's happening in Iraq. Then that becomes sort of a real challenge for the military. That's part of what they have to put forward by 2016 as the integration of women into the military. It's not just what you're talking about, but also this whole support structure has to change, and some thinking about, well, what does that mean? And can we do that? So, I think that I want to keep my eye on how it actually becomes a reality, because right now it isn't. It's so hypothetical on some level for the military to actually be making this move. They don't even know what to do with it fully. They're playing the game well, and they're kind of trying hard, but this is really a brand new game. And the degree to which that Jean was right, that war is a narrative that men and warriors will narrate, the degree to which that kind of notion of the natural law of gender, in a sense, and cannot be changed in war holds is I think, the thing that we ought to find actually interesting and amazing that that's still holding today in countries like the United States and the West, where there's such controversy. I think that Deborah might want to say something.
I'm not sure I can add much to what you've said. I think, though, I would echo what Christine has said about, the worst case scenario to which you are alluding is some sort of conflict in which there is a universal draft and many people are going to die. Because otherwise, I do think, even in the case of a draft, and you have to deal with various issues, right? One of them is parents both fighting. And that's probably the primary issue. The other issue is just simply should, and it seems unlikely, but we can't see the future, some sort of World War I situation in which, 1/3 of Europe died. I don't think you want to lose 1/3 of your women between the ages of 18 and 30. So, but that seems an unlikely scenario, and one it's hard to speculate on. Otherwise, it seems like women could be assigned to non-infantry roles. But I don't know that. Yeah, right. I mean, as I said in my paper, some of these things are not soluble. But I also think the women's being weaker might be a little overplayed also. So anyway, I think we need to wrap up because Michael's here.
Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.